Over the course of my life, I'd built a business empire that spanned across several industries. From humble beginnings, I'd gone from a young man with a dream to a successful business owner with substantial wealth. I'd worked tirelessly, pulling long hours, making tough decisions, and taking risks that paid off. It wasn't easy, but every sacrifice I made seemed worth it. The money, the recognition, the lifestyle, it all seemed like a reward for the countless nights spent away from home, the missed family gatherings, and the endless meetings. But in the end, none of it mattered more than the people I was leaving behind. I always assumed my sons would inherit everything once I was gone. Matt and Kyle were the only family I had left. I had watched them grow up, one more driven than the other, but both with their own ambitions. Matt, the elder, was sharp and methodical. He'd always been the one who followed the rules. Kyle, on the other hand, was the more impulsive of the two. He had a knack for taking risks and seeking adventure, though sometimes his choices made me scratch my head. Despite their differences, I never doubted that they would be able to carry on my legacy. They were my flesh and blood, after all, but as the years went by, something started to gnaw at me. I could feel it in my gut, an unsettling sensation I couldn't shake. They seemed sincere whenever they'd talk about taking over the business. They'd always tell me how they planned to keep the family name strong, to make sure our company thrived, and how they were grateful for the opportunities they'd been given. But I was no fool. I had seen it before. Families torn apart when money was involved. Greed, envy, jealousy, these emotions could destroy even the most solid of bonds. And as my time on this earth was ticking away, I couldn't ignore the feeling that perhaps my sons weren't immune to the same forces that had torn apart so many other families. I had watched the way they interacted with one another. On the surface, they seemed to get along fine, but every now and then, I'd catch a look, a brief fleeting moment where I saw a hint of rivalry, or worse, a flicker of resentment. They were both vying for my approval, and it was becoming more and more apparent to me that each of them thought they were the one who truly deserved to take the reins. I had always given them guidance, taught them the value of hard work, of loyalty, of perseverance, but I wasn't sure if they fully understood the weight of what they were about to inherit. I remember a conversation I had with Matt a few months ago. We were sitting in my study, the old leather chair creaking beneath me as I leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. He had been talking about expanding the business, about pushing into new markets and increasing profits. His voice was filled with enthusiasm, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness maybe, a hunger that I hadn't noticed before. When I asked him what he thought about the future, he didn't speak of our family's values or the importance of leaving a legacy. No, his focus was on growth, on numbers, on maximizing profit. It didn't sit right with me. I had built this business not just for the money, but for something greater. It was about providing for future generations, about honoring the work that had gone into every single deal, every partnership, every decision. Kyle, on the other hand, had been more unpredictable. He would often talk about his desire to make big moves, to shake things up, to modernize everything. I appreciated his drive, but I couldn't help but feel like he was more interested in the thrill of success than the responsibility that came with it. He had a quick mind, yes, but sometimes it was as if he didn't fully grasp the stakes. It was all about the next big thing, the next big risk. And while that was admirable in some ways, it worried me. Leadership required more than just taking risks. It was about making the right calls, about understanding the long-term consequences of every decision. Both of them had their strengths, of course, and I loved them deeply, but I could see the writing on the wall. The more I listened to them, the more I realized that they were both preparing for a future without fully appreciating what it would cost them. Sure, they said the right things, about family, about legacy, but I had seen too many families get torn apart by greed and ambition. I knew how easy it was to lose sight of what really mattered once the money started flowing in. And so, I began to entertain a thought that seemed increasingly inevitable. I didn't trust them, not fully at least, not enough to leave everything to chance. I had always tried to be a fair father, a good business partner, and a mentor. But at the end of the day, I was just a man, and I didn't have forever. My legacy was too important to let it fall into the wrong hands. I had to know, with absolute certainty, whether or not my sons were capable of carrying on what I had built, or if they were simply waiting for the right moment to betray everything I had worked for. So, as my mind churned with doubt and skepticism, I began to plan. I couldn't shake the thought that if my sons were truly trustworthy, they would prove it. But how? How could I test their loyalty without tipping my hand too soon? The answer didn't come quickly, but as the days passed, a plan began to form. A test, a way to separate the men from the boys, so to speak. They had promised me that they would divide my wealth fairly, that they would protect the family business and ensure its future. But I couldn't rely on promises alone. Promises could be broken, and so I made the decision. I would fake my death. It was a risky move, but I felt it was the only way to truly understand who my sons were when they thought I was gone. Would they stay true to their word, or would they reveal their true colors once they believed there was nothing left to stop them? The decision was made, the seed was planted, and I would do whatever it took to find out if the men I had raised could be trusted to honor my legacy, or if they were just like every other family that had been torn apart by the lure of money. After weeks of brooding over the matter, I knew what had to be done. I couldn't just sit by and let my sons take over without knowing what they would really do with the power. It was a test I had to conduct, one that would expose their true intentions, whether they liked it or not. The idea of faking my death was audacious, but it seemed like the only way to get the answers I needed. If they were truly honorable, they would show respect and loyalty even after I was gone. But if their true motives were anything less than honorable, I would have proof, irrefutable proof that I couldn't trust them with the future of my empire. I started planning in secret, keeping everything as quiet as possible. My first task was to make sure the whole thing would be believable. It wasn't just about disappearing, it was about creating a spectacle that would fool everyone. I had spent years building relationships, and I couldn't risk having even one person suspect that something was off. So I enlisted the help of someone I knew could pull it off, a professional actor with a knack for impersonating people. He had the right looks, the right mannerisms, and more importantly, he was discreet. The actor and I met several times in a nondescript cafe, a place where no one would recognize us. I didn't trust anyone outside of the immediate circle I had carefully selected for this plan. The actor and I went over every detail, from the way he would carry himself at the funeral to the small gestures and facial expressions that would mimic my own. It wasn't enough for him to simply look like me. He had to embody me. He had to be me in every sense of the word, down to the smallest nuance. I even had him shadow me for a week, just so he could get a better sense of how I moved, how I spoke, and how I interacted with others. The actor and I had to be on the same page, or this plan would fall apart before it even started. I knew my sons better than anyone, and I was certain they wouldn't notice at first. But there was always the possibility that someone would question the authenticity of the funeral, and that was something I couldn't afford. So we spent hours rehearsing. He studied my old videos, my interviews, even the way I answered phone calls. I knew this would be the most important performance of his life. The next step in the plan was a more delicate matter: how to actually stage my death. I had to figure out how to disappear without leaving behind any trace. I didn't want any suspicious autopsies or investigations into the cause of my death. After all, the actor would need to be me in every possible way, and that meant taking on the most crucial part of the charade: dying. To achieve this, I came up with a health scare. I had the actor pose as a close relative of mine and speak to a few trusted people in my circle, making it seem like I had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. I made sure the news spread quietly enough that it would appear legitimate, but not so loudly that anyone would catch on too quickly. When the time was right, I would disappear. My trusted team, who I had carefully selected to assist in the operation, was briefed on every step of the plan. They would arrange the funeral, manage the logistics, and make sure everything went smoothly. I even gave them the task of sending out invites to the most influential people in my life, the friends, colleagues, and associates who had known me for decades. I needed the whole thing to be convincing. I couldn't afford for anyone to doubt that I was truly gone. For a while, I kept the whole thing to myself. I couldn't even let my sons know what I was planning. As much as I wanted to believe in their integrity, I knew I couldn't trust them yet. They would be part of the plan too, though they wouldn't know it until it was too late. In my mind, this wasn't about hurting them. This was about forcing them to show me who they really were. I needed to know if the promises they had made to me would hold up once they thought I was out of the picture. The day I sent out the invitations for my fake funeral, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. There was no turning back now. The plan was set in motion, and I had no choice but to let it unfold. I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. Was I doing the right thing? Or was I being paranoid, setting up a scenario that would only end in regret. But then I remembered the doubts that had been festering inside me for so long. My sons, despite all their promises, hadn't earned my trust, and so I had to take matters into my own hands. This was the only way to know for sure who they were beneath all the surface-level assurances. And as I looked at the papers in front of me, the meticulously drawn-up plans, the timeline, the contracts, and the funeral arrangements, I steeled myself. If they were truly worthy of my legacy, they would prove it. And if not, I would have a lesson to teach them that they would never forget. The day arrived, and with it, the culmination of weeks of careful planning. I stood in the shadows, watching as the funeral unfolded before me. Everything had been arranged meticulously. Every detail, every person, every gesture. The casket, which contained not my body, but that of the actor I had hired, sat at the front of the church. The mourners filed in slowly, exchanging hushed whispers and somber looks. The room was filled with familiar faces, friends, colleagues, business partners, and a handful of distant family members who had been invited under the guise of paying their respects. The church was quiet, too quiet. The air was heavy with the kind of grief that comes when a giant in the community is gone. The grand, ornate stained glass windows cast faint, colorful light across the room, casting an almost surreal glow over the proceedings. There was something about the silence that made the weight of the moment feel tangible, as if the entire world had paused in acknowledgement of my passing. I could see my sons standing at the front, right next to the casket, their faces etched with sadness. Matt, the older of the two, had always been the more emotionally open one, while Kyle, the younger, tended to hide his feelings behind a stoic expression. Today, though, both of them were visibly shaken. They appeared devastated, though I knew that their grief was part of the performance. They didn't know, of course, that I was watching from a concealed spot, hidden behind a curtain at the back of the church. The plan had to play out just as I imagined it, and for now, they were the stars of the show. The actor, who had assumed my identity for the past several days, lay motionless in the casket. He had been expertly prepared for the role. His clothing was identical to what I would have worn on such an occasion: pressed suit, tie, and the kind of formal attire I had always preferred. I had even insisted that the actor adopt my habitual pose, arms crossed slightly over the chest, face relaxed in a neutral expression. It had to be perfect. Every detail had to align for the illusion to hold. The actor's face, though, was the only part that couldn't quite match mine. His features, though close, were still obviously different. But it was enough to fool the majority of those in attendance, and that was all that mattered. As the mourners began to settle in, I noticed the people who had come to say their goodbyes. Many of them had known me for decades, some through business, some through personal connections. There was an air of reverence as they filed past the casket, muttering prayers or sharing brief, heartfelt comments. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of irony. These were the same people who, in my absence, would have to decide what to make of my empire, whether it would fall into chaos or continue to thrive. The thought of my legacy being torn apart by those who had claimed to care for me was too much to bear, but today, the scene unfolding was meant to be a warning, a test for those closest to me. The service itself was a blur of speeches, prayers, and the heavy presence of grief. I had instructed Matt and Kyle to deliver eulogies, though I hadn't given them any specific direction on what to say. It was important that they speak from the heart, or at least appear to. They approached the microphone one after the other, their voices cracking as they recounted the moments we had shared, the lessons I had taught them, and the legacy I had built over my lifetime. The words were predictable but emotionally charged, so much so that a few of the attendees dabbed their eyes with tissues. They had done well, it was almost believable, but the entire time, I sat there, hidden, studying their faces for any sign of the true emotions behind their words. As they spoke, I felt a growing sense of unease. I had always wanted to believe that my sons were genuine, that they held the same values I did, but as I listened to their speeches, a nagging voice in the back of my mind began to wonder. How much of this was real? How much of this was merely a performance to get what they wanted? Were they truly mourning the loss of their father, or were they already thinking about the empire they were about to inherit? The actor, now lying still in the casket, gave no indication of the tension hanging in the air. He was nothing more than a puppet in this grand charade. I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. He had been paid well for his services, but he didn't know the full scope of the plan. For him, this was just another job. But for me, this was everything. This was my final test, and I was determined to see it through. After the eulogies, the service continued with the usual rituals, prayers, hymns, and moments of silence. The crowd began to dissipate slowly as people came forward to offer their condolences to Matt and Kyle. Some people lingered, exchanging pleasantries, but I could tell that the tension was mounting. I had to make sure that the next step in my plan would unfold just as I had intended. My sons needed to understand the weight of their actions, and I had to ensure that the game was far from over. The funeral wasn't just a farewell to my life. It was the beginning of a lesson they would never forget. As the last mourners began to leave and the funeral home grew quieter, I took a deep breath and prepared for the next phase of my plan. The stage was set, and it was time to show them who they truly were. The funeral had been nothing short of an emotional spectacle. The tears, the eulogies, the somber mood. It all played out perfectly. My sons, still caught in their grief and the momentary rush of their perceived victory, hadn't even noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. As the mourners slowly trickled out of the church, their faces still heavy with emotion, I knew it was time to set the wheels in motion for the next phase of my plan. After the service, I arranged for the actor to meet my sons privately. I had made sure he understood the situation and was prepared to do what I needed him to do, convince them that he was the one who now controlled my estate. The actor had been briefed thoroughly. He knew his lines, his role, and his limits. All he had to do was play the part of the deceased patriarch's lawyer and offer my sons a deal so tempting they wouldn't be able to resist. He was told to sell the empire for a fraction of its value, 1/3 to be precise, and present it as a fair final settlement of my estate. The shock and desperation would make them too eager to think clearly. They were already emotionally compromised by the loss, their minds clouded by grief, and the thought of immediate control over the empire was too powerful a temptation to pass up. I watched from a hidden camera feed as the actor greeted my sons in my office, which I had prepped with the usual trappings of a serious business meeting: mahogany furniture, bookshelves lined with decades of financial reports, and the grand desk that had once been mine. This room was a symbol of my hard work, my success, and the empire I had spent my life building. The actor sat at my desk, calm and collected, waiting for the arrival of my sons. When they entered, their faces were still drawn from the funeral, but there was a palpable shift in their demeanor as they noticed the presence of the actor, who had assumed my place in this strange drama. They exchanged confused glances, but the actor wasted no time. He greeted them formally, offering his condolences once again in a manner that was so perfectly rehearsed, it almost felt real. But his voice was cool, methodical. He was a man doing a job, not someone grieving the death of a father. As my sons settled in, the actor slid a thick envelope across the table. The room was silent for a moment, and I could feel the tension building as they both eyed the contract inside the envelope, unsure of what to expect. The actor spoke first, outlining the terms of my estate. He emphasized that, according to my will, the empire was being sold to them at a price that was less than 1/3 of its actual value. This was the final deal, he said. No negotiations, no going back. This was the inheritance they had been waiting for. The deal seemed absurd to me, even as I watched it unfold. The empire I had built over the years was worth far more than a mere fraction of its true value, but I knew exactly how to manipulate them. My sons, desperate for control and blinded by their grief, didn't hesitate. I could see it in their eyes, the hunger, the urgency. They were already picturing themselves in charge of the sprawling business, imagining the power, the wealth, and the freedom that would come with it. The actor presented them with the contract. The language was simple and direct, and there was no mention of any hidden clauses or protections for me. It was an offer they couldn't resist. For the cost of just 1/3 of what they would be inheriting, they could seize it all, immediately. The terms seemed too good to be true, but in their desperation, they didn't question it. There was no time to hesitate, no time to think. It was the moment they had been waiting for, and their emotions were working against them. Kyle, the younger son, was the first to sign. His hand shook slightly as he took the pen, but he didn't pause. He was already envisioning himself at the helm, directing the business, making decisions. He signed the document with an almost eager flourish. Matt followed suit quickly, his face a mixture of determination and greed. He had always been more cautious, but the urgency of the moment had overridden his better judgment. He signed the paper, sealing their fate. The actor sat back in his chair, watching them with a calm, almost amused expression. He had done his job well, and now it was only a matter of waiting for the inevitable fallout. He handed them copies of the signed contract, nodding politely as they stood up, still processing what had just happened. They had bought the empire for a fraction of its worth, without even realizing it. They thought they had won, but I knew the truth. They had been outplayed. As I watched from my hidden vantage point, I could feel a sense of grim satisfaction. It was a bitter irony. My sons had just signed away their future, and they didn't even know it. They thought they had beaten the system, that they had seized everything they had ever wanted. But what they didn't realize was that they had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. The deal they had signed was nothing more than a trap, one that would lead to their downfall. They didn't know it yet, but the true game was just beginning. The empire they thought they had gained so easily was already slipping through their fingers, and the lesson they needed to learn would soon be delivered in the most dramatic way possible. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching everything unfold before my eyes. I had spent so much time planning this test, and now that the moment had arrived, I couldn't help but feel a weight pressing down on me. My sons, Matt and Kyle, had just signed the papers that would change everything. The deal was done, the ink was dry, and they had no idea how easily they had been manipulated. In that instant, I saw the greed in their eyes, the hunger for power and control, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Kyle, the younger of the two, was practically bouncing in his seat as he looked at the papers in front of him. I had always known he had a certain impulsiveness, a hunger to take risks, and this was no different. As soon as the deal was done, he seemed exhilarated. I could see his mind racing with thoughts of all the things he would now own. The business, the properties, the cars. Everything I had worked so hard for was now in his hands, and he couldn't wait to take control. His eagerness, though, was almost pathetic, like a child with a new toy, too naive to understand its true value. Matt, on the other hand, was more reserved. He was always the more thoughtful of the two, the one who would take his time to consider all options. But today, even Matt seemed swept up in the excitement. He leaned back in his chair, holding the papers in his hand, but I could see the slight frown forming on his face. A flicker of doubt passed through his eyes, and for a brief moment, I thought he might actually pause to question the deal. But that hesitation was fleeting. He quickly shook it off, told himself this was the best move, and signed with a sharp stroke of the pen. Just like that, the business, the legacy, everything was theirs. And I watched them celebrate like they had just won the lottery. As I stood there in the shadows, my heart ached. I had watched them grow up, taught them everything I knew, and poured all my energy into building this empire. And yet, here they were, trading it all away for a fraction of its true worth. The deal they had signed was a farce, a cheap imitation of the value of everything I had worked for, and they didn't even know it. They had been so quick to sign, so eager to claim what they thought was theirs, that they didn't stop to think for a second about the consequences. It wasn't about the money to them, it was about power, and it was in that moment that I realized just how far they had fallen from the values I had tried so hard to instill in them. But the most painful part wasn't their greed. It wasn't even the betrayal itself. The hardest thing to swallow was the fact that they had done this without any remorse. No second thoughts, no consideration for what this meant for the legacy I had built. They hadn't even stopped to think about how they would look back on this day years from now. No, they were too wrapped up in the moment, too excited about what they had just secured. In their minds, this was victory. They had won. I couldn't help but think of the countless families I had seen torn apart by greed over the years. Fathers and sons, brothers at war with each other over businesses and estates. I had seen it all, and I had always promised myself I would never let it happen to me. But as I watched my sons celebrate, I saw the same signs that had ruined so many before me, the same ambition, the same hunger for control, the same willingness to betray everything they once held dear for a taste of power. And then there was the irony. Here they were, signing away my legacy without even knowing it. The actor I had hired to play my part at the funeral, he had convinced them to take this deal for a third of the value of my empire. A third! A mere fraction of what it was truly worth. But they didn't care. They were blinded by their greed. It didn't matter to them that they had just sold out everything I had built. It didn't matter that they were sacrificing years of hard work and dedication for a quick win. What they didn't understand was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I wasn't dead, and the contract they had signed wasn't worth the paper it was written on. They thought they had gotten the best of me, but what they didn't know was that they were the ones who had been outplayed. It was almost laughable. The whole thing was so tragically predictable. But the worst part wasn't even the deal itself. It was the realization that I had failed them. All those years of teaching them the value of hard work, of honesty, of loyalty, it hadn't stuck. I had raised them to believe that they could carry on my work, that they would be worthy stewards of the legacy I had created. And yet, here they were, willing to throw it all away in the blink of an eye. They didn't see the value of the empire, the relationships, the trust I had built over decades. To them, it was just a business, just a set of numbers, just a way to make money. And that, more than anything, cut deeper than any betrayal could. As I watched them sit there, still basking in the false sense of victory, I couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. Would they have made this choice if they knew I was watching? Would they have thought twice if they knew they weren't about to inherit everything just because I was gone? I would never know, but I could tell from their expressions that it was too late now. The damage had been done. This moment, this betrayal, wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. I had made a mistake by trusting them too much. I had given them everything, and in return, they had shown me who they truly were. Now, all I could do was wait for the fallout. They thought they had won, but I knew the game was just beginning. What they had done today would haunt them for the rest of their lives, whether they realized it or not. The time had finally come. For hours I lay still in that coffin, a sense of surreal calm sweeping over me as I heard the voices of my sons, their words filled with self-assuredness, with no idea of the deception unfolding. I had done everything in my power to orchestrate this moment. They thought they had won, that the empire was theirs for the taking, that they had successfully manipulated the situation to their advantage. I could hear their quiet laughter, the murmurs of excitement. Perhaps they were already planning what they would do with the wealth, the businesses, the power. Then, as the funeral service wrapped up, I knew it was time to act. Slowly, I reached out and pushed the coffin lid open just a little, the wood creaking in the stillness of the room. My heart was pounding, but I had to stay composed. I pushed harder, and then, with a deep breath, I rose to my feet and stepped out of the coffin. As soon as they saw me, their faces drained of color. The shock on their faces was a sight I would never forget. Their eyes widened, their mouths agape, and they staggered back, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The room fell into a stunned silence. One of them finally found his voice. "Dad," Matt stammered, as though trying to make sense of the impossible. I stood there, tall and steady, looking them both in the eye. "Surprised?" I asked, my tone cold, deliberate. "Did you think you could get away with it? Did you really believe that everything I had built was so easy to take?" There was no immediate response, just a silence thick with confusion and fear. I continued, my voice firm and calm, though a storm was raging inside me. "I saw it all. I saw how you two signed those papers without a second thought, willing to betray everything I built for a fraction of its worth. You were so quick to sell it all, to cash in and move on, to take what you thought was yours." I let my words hang in the air, watching their expressions shift from disbelief to guilt. "I hired an actor to make it seem like I was gone, but you were the ones who sealed your own fate. You didn't care about my legacy, my empire, or the hard work I put into everything. All you saw was an opportunity to line your pockets, to claim what wasn't yours." There was a brief pause before Kyle, who had been standing motionless, seemed to snap back to reality. His face reddened with a mix of panic and embarrassment, but it was too late. "Dad, we didn't—" I cut him off. "Don't try to justify it now. You've already shown me who you really are. Greed has clouded your judgment, and now the truth is clear." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the real contract, the one that nullified the deal they had just signed. I held it up, letting them see it in my hands. "This contract means nothing. You signed away nothing. It's void. Your so-called inheritance is gone." They stood there, frozen, unable to respond, their minds clearly struggling to process everything. They had played a dangerous game, thinking they had outsmarted me, but now they understood. "Today was a test," I said, my voice unwavering, "and you failed. The empire doesn't belong to you. Not now, not ever. A long silence followed. The weight of the moment hit them, and the reality of their actions sank in. I could see the regret begin to form on their faces, but it was too little, too late. Trust and loyalty had been shattered beyond repair. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind to grapple with the mess they had created. There was nothing more to say. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was out of the picture, and now they would have to live with the consequences.